And we are live, officially to discuss the Ukraine situation from Russia's perspective. I am, of course, joined by some amazing guests who I allow to introduce themselves. Go ahead.
Hello, so I am Noble Crusader, and I basically started this YouTube channel recently. And in this channel, I basically discuss politics, economics, history, and alternate history, and geopolitical news. So if you're interested in any of that, just be sure to check my channel out, and we'll learn more from there.
And I am Raging Mandrill. This is my first time streaming with America Populist. However, I am somebody who's more frequently associated with the prudentialist and academic agent circles. And I do have a YouTube channel with a couple of videos, and I, do a lot of streams in regards to foreign policy with prudentialists and that sort of thing. So it's nice to be back on a stream again.
Isn't it? It's great to have you gentlemen join me to have a great discussion about this subject, about Ukraine, of course, which is something the U.S. establishment is obsessed with for some reason that we will go into. So, as we all know, the Ukraine situation, just to give you a quick rundown if you're unaware, tension has been escalating recently over Russia's decision to move troops to the western Ukraine and units to Belarus, which the West has perceived as going to be an imminent invasion of Ukraine. Of course, echoing the 2014 annexation of Crimea, but that's a bit different. And so, this decision by the West to focus on trying to get this escalation going has two primary focuses, of course. And they want to expand NATO's influence, of course, and certify Russia's influence over Eastern Europe. So that's the current situation right now, as the West wants to do. That's the way I see it, of course, but my guests may have a different perspective on what the situation is currently.
Well, I have a similar perspective as you did, American Populist. I believe that the West basically wants to contain Russia. That's also why, after the collapse of the USSR, you saw former Eastern Bloc states join NATO. So I believe that NATO and the EU just want to ensure that Russia basically doesn't have any more leverage within Eastern Europe because they basically just want Eastern Europe for themselves. And that's also why you see the media, for instance, hyping calls for war, saying war is imminent, because they just want to rally up, all the masses to be against Russia, since at the end of the day, they just want to contain Russia. That's basically what I view it as.
Yeah, and from the inverse perspective, from the Russian perspective, Ukraine has been a very long-standing, segment of Russia. It was part of the Soviet Union. It was part of the Russian Empire before that, and even the ruler of the Russian state, Vladimir Putin, has basically penned an essay over the last summer where he is, given the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine, which in his mind, at least, are incredibly long-standing. And as long as there's been a state which could be considered Russia, Ukraine has been a part of that, at least in his view. And that's shared in viewpoint by Russian thinkers who are more hardline than Putin himself. That's shared by Alexander Dugin, who's much more of a spiritualist perspective, and he comes from the viewpoint that a land is part of a people, and it's also part of the culture, and the narod is his term. And so he views basically Russian territory that's always been part of Russia to be Russia. So that's the Russian perspective on this.
Indeed, it is. And we will go into more in depth on the Russian perspective in just a second, as I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint that we can discuss the situation from Russia's point of view and have some great conversations. So, Russia's concerns, do they matter? And Sergei Lavrov presented this list to the NATO ambassador, I believe is his name. And they basically wanted NATO to demobilize their units in Eastern Europe, stop expanding to Eastern Europe, and stop the hostilities, basically. And the series of demands was met by screeching autism by the media, saying it's unacceptable for Russia to present these demands. nations are allowed to choose whose alliance they want to be in, whose military assets are allowed to be near whose borders, of course, ignoring Russia's principal interests and concerns if Ukraine was ever to become a member of NATO, and the security concerns, of course, that the big gay and NATO is not concerned with, of course. They are more interested in pursuing America's interests is who their donors are, of course. But let's get into some history, of course, because that is very interesting. So, the long history between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the modern lands of Russia and Ukraine, the steppe, have been home to many nomadic tribes throughout centuries. Herodotus originally described these people as Scythians, who inhabited the Ponto-Greek steppe lands of modern-day Ukraine and Russia, which is a very flat area, if you know the terrain. And many tribes have gone through this area, of course, throughout the centuries, until the land was predominantly settled by Slavs in the mid-12th century, I believe that's correct. And that was when the founding of the first Kievan Rus state was, when many patchworks of city-states in modern Ukraine and Russia became together in a modern state in the medieval ages, of course, which were ruled from Kiev. And the state first became Christianized by Vladimir the Great, pictured on the left here, baptizing people on the Dnieper River, bringing people to Orthodox Christianity, and becoming a founding mythos in the history of Russia and Ukraine, which presents many of the bases for Russia's founding as a modern state, of course, originate in this Kievan Rus state and its many patchworks that descend after its collapse in the medieval ages. If you guys have something to add, you can go ahead and do that.
Not right now. I'm just listening to the history lesson.
All right, then we can move on. And so we're moving up a little bit forward, and let's move on to the claims of Nouveau Russia. Nouveau Russia is a term that originates from Tsar Catherine the Great's expansion to the Zaporozhian Cossacks in southern and eastern Ukraine, taking them from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and absorbing them, of course, from the influence of both Poland and the Ottoman Empire, and settling these lands with Russian settlers, of course. And this land, of course, became christened Nouveau Russia, and were governed by Prince Ponakovdin, Catherine II's great lover. And these lands, of course, presented a historical gain in the history of the Russian Empire, granting them access to the Black Sea coast, Crimea, more on the Caucasus front as well, as you can see near the Caspian Sea. And this land is historically significant to the Russian Empire, as it is seen as historically the people of this land, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, during the Treaty of Poltava. I'm not sure how you pronounce the treaty, that was signed when the Zaporozhian Cossacks decided to defect from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and swear oaths of loyalty to the Tsar of the Russian Empire in exchange for his protection from the Poles and the Ottomans. And that is seen as a founding piece of Ukraine and Russia's founding mythos, and presents many of the founding reasons for why these splits in eastern and southern Ukraine still exist, from its origins in the 17th century, of course.
I'll just add something here. So the conquest by the Russians of the Crimea in the 18th century, this was a long-standing project for them. Like the Russian Tsars had wanted that region for a very, very long time before they actually got it. So that's quite an accomplishment for them. And so, like, this is just getting into the historical mindset here is important to realize. Like, the Russians consider this to be part of Russia. And yeah, it's fascinating here.
Yeah, I'll also like to add something as well. So basically, in this point of history, we can see how Russia is basically expanding like westward, and I guess it seems similar to today, during this time they were essentially, I guess, using Ukraine as like a buffer to protect themselves from foreign powers, whether it be Poland or the Ottoman Empire. And I guess you can compare it to today, where Russia wants to kind of like use Ukraine as a buffer zone to protect it from NATO. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, Crusader. Russia militarily has always traded territory in exchange for time. Basically, that's anybody who's even remotely familiar with Russian military history understands that this is something that the Russians do pretty consistently, and Ukraine is a very useful buffer state for doing that, as well as all the Baltic states as well. So from Russia's perspective, in terms of like frontage, you can just imagine looking at the map right here. Um, if somebody has already taken the Crimea, that's an incredibly much longer area of front that you'll have to defend than if you were defending the front, say, from the Baltics to Odessa right there. So that's just a smaller area to defend.
Yeah, also this land is just so vast that it's very difficult for an invading army or conqueror to take it because the supply lines are very difficult, as we saw in both the world wars and Napoleon's invasion of the Russian Empire. Logistics became a death sentence for many who tried to conquer the Russian lands of the east, as they were very wide and featureless, making supply lines very narrow and easy to ambush. Bottlenecks, of course. Presenting things, it's very much more difficult to conquer things in the east just because it's so vast.
Mhm.
And of course, another reason for this expansion is something you'll get to in Russian history is warm water port access. As before this expansion by Peter the Great and Catherine II, Russia's only ports were Arkhangelsk in the Arctic Sea and St. Petersburg, which of course are frozen in the wintertime. And so Russia's interest is obviously getting a warm water port that isn't frozen for a portion of the year, and they wouldn't get that until the 17th century with the annexation of Novorossiya on the Black Sea, with the annexation of Odessa and Sevastopol, and later on with the founding of Vladivostok in the east. Another reason for why the Russians consider these lands very critical to their expansion, to their founding state. And so moving on from some of that more ancient history, we move on to some more modern history, of course. The Soviet Union, a very gay state, we shall say, but Ukraine was considered a very founding member of this state, of course. It was tried to conquered by the Germans in World War II to get the grain of the Ukraine, and the eastern regions of Ukraine are very industrialized, so that was a main point. And also the Crimea, also to get access to the Caucasus oil fields, as you can see on this map, Ukraine and Kazakhstan make this gap right here that's called the Volgodon Gap. And if you were to cut this gap off, you would cut the North Caucasus off from the Russian heartland, thus making it easier to take the oil fields in the North Caucasus and also cut off Russia's access to the Caspian Sea's oil and gas reserves, which are very critical to the Russian state's finances, as 50% of Russia's modern day exports are gas and oil. And so that's why this area is very critical to Russia's security concerns.
Yeah, to add on your point about what you made in Ukraine, I also went over this in my video. Yeah, Ukraine was heavily fought between the Soviets and the Nazis. Hitler had an interest with Ukraine, and not many people know this, but Ukraine is actually agriculturally sufficient. They produce grain and a variety of crops, and so that does serve to benefit a nation. And I think that's another reason as to why Russia desires Ukraine, because of all the crops that it could give Russia, as opposed to Russia's land, which doesn't produce a variety of crops. So I do think there's also an economic motive as to why Russia desires Ukraine.
Yes.
Right. And of course, if you're Russia and you're going to be hit by sanctions whenever you're attempting to assert your interests geopolitically, it'd be very, very helpful to have this a very fertile region, so you don't have to rely on American corn and soybeans. So yeah.
It's also very critical to Russia's security concerns, as a hostile Ukrainian state presents a grave threat to Russia's interests in the southern military district in the North Caucasus front, as well as the Crimea Peninsula and the Caspian Sea, which could be cut off if a coordinated army were to get Kazakhstan and Ukraine on side. But that's beyond the point of this main point. The Ukraine SSR was one of the main founding republics of Russia. As of course, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire before the formation of the Soviet Union, and was considered very critical, as is the breadbasket of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, as it is a very fertile farmland. Most of Ukraine is a fertile plain, which can grow crops very easily. And other than that, its significance is mainly its connection between Ukrainians and Russians, which Putin points out in his essay that you mentioned earlier. He sees Ukrainians and Russians as spiritually the same people inhabiting the same space spiritually, which goes back to the founding of the Kievan Rus state, which gave the origins for the modern Russian state and the Russian Empire before that, and now the Russian Federation now. And so the history between Ukraine and Russia, it's very complicated, of course. There was the Holodomor in Russia, in Ukraine, which made many Ukrainians very bitter about Soviet rule, which is why the Nazis into Ukraine, as they saw them as liberators, until the Nazis started to starve them out because they viewed the Ukrainians as lower in the racial hierarchy.
Just to tag on to that point there, the Nazis actually also kept collectivized farming in the Ukraine during World War II, so that was another reason for friction, because the Ukrainians hated collectivized farming.
Yeah, because the Nazis made a bad mistake in Ukraine, since they viewed Ukrainians as inferior, and so since they did this incentivized the Ukrainians to still remain loyal to the Soviet Union, which cost them heavily in the war. And I do think during the war there were some Ukrainians who were loyal to the Nazis, and the Nazis would use them to obtain their crops.
Definitely. Also, important things to mention during World War II is, of course, the Battle for Sevastopol, in which was the second longest siege on the Eastern Front, if my memory serves me correct, right after Leningrad, in which many Russians fought to the death to protect the port of Sevastopol, which they fought previously in the Crimean War. This goes to show Russia's connection to the Crimean Peninsula. There goes just beyond modern history, of course. It goes back into ancient history as well, and pre-modern history. Also, another thing to mention about this map here is that Ukrainians and Russians during this time were viewed as the same people, essentially, and there was no difference, essentially, during the Soviet Union times and during the Russian Empire as well. They were essentially the same people because they both spoke Russian, the majority. Only a minority in Ukraine actually spoke Ukrainian during the Soviet Union. It wasn't until after Ukraine got its independence that Ukrainian was the majority language in Ukraine, I believe. Also in Belarus, the same thing, until modern times. And so that presented another spiritual connection, as they both spoke Russian and viewed each other as the same, as they knew how to founding mythos for fighting off both the Nazis, who sought to destroy them, of course, in their racial annihilation, which presented a closeness between the Ukrainian Republic and the Russian Republic during this time.
And another short thing I want to add is that, yeah, we do see how Ukrainian and Russian history is linked, since I guess you can state that both of their histories began with the founding of the Kievan Rus, and this just shows as to how much connected both countries are.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and long history there. And still, let's move on from the Soviet Union. So post-Soviet collapse. So once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine gained its independence. And unlike what the Western sources will try to tell you now, that Ukraine has always wanted to be independent from Russia. Actually, Ukraine, from its very independence, was actually very cordial with the Russians and maintained very good relations, especially because they had a lease on the warm water port of Sevastopol for 99 years, of course. and the Crimea. And also a significant Russian minority lives in the Donbass and Luhansk Oblast. And so this relationship was very secure, actually, up until recently, up until the Orange Revolution. Ukrainians and Russians still viewed each other as friendly people, essentially the same historical people, even though there was differences, of course, with the language that was now being introduced, except for the eastern portions of Ukraine. But this also presented an interesting perspective. In 2014, the Maidan Revolution occurred, which ended this friendly relationship as the Russian-friendly president, Viktor Yanukovych, was forced to flee Kiev after the Orange Revolution ousted him from power in a coup to essentially bring Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence. And this event also inspired on Russians who living in the Crimea to officially declare their independence and then annexation by Crimea. And so that annexation by Crimea also encouraged the Russians living in Donetsk and Luhansk in the eastern portion right here to declare themselves independent republics, as they did not want to be part of a hostile Ukraine to the Russian Federation. And so that's more of the 2014 history as to why Ukrainians are now hostile to the Russians.
Yeah, just to add on a little bit. Yeah, this did begin in 2014 since the Ukrainian president didn't want to establish economic ties with the EU as he wanted to improve economic ties with Russia. And as we know, the EU despised that. And so they basically instigated these protests against him to ensure that a government that would be favorable to the EU would be instituted. And so that's how you had this conflict spiral out. And then you also had, the Ukrainians in the Donbass region fight to secede and become part of Russia. And then you also had other Ukrainians who were supportive of the West. And then it just turned into a complete civil war, essentially.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that this Orange Revolution is like a typical U.S. Inspired or executed color revolution here. So, the guy who got ousted from that color revolution, Yanukovych, this is somebody who's a lot more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin and to Russia's interests, right? So for him to get ousted in that kind of manner, from the Russian perspective, looks like basically he was pushed out by U.S. Intelligence, essentially. So from Russia's perspective, you have this sympathetic figure who is now going to get pushed out of power in a quote unquote undemocratic fashion. And so they're not going to be willing to accept that outcome.
Yes, he also, I believe, his successor also wanted to end the lease on the warm water port of Sevastopol, which prompted Russia to annex the Crimean Peninsula, as the Russians did not want to come under now hostile Ukrainian rule, which is one of the main reasons why in 2014 Crimea was annexed, and the warm water port of Sevastopol was a critical component of this, of course, as the port has a long history of being fought for by the Russians in both the World Wars and in the Crimean War. Also, Russia's interest in defending this blue area, as we're going to see, and it's the same in the 2010 election as well. The split in Ukrainian society is also where the term Nouveau comes from, as we saw earlier. These lands were originally settled by Russians, and the Russian language was spread about them, of course, and they're still majority speaking Russian, I believe, these provinces in the south. As they're not all ethnically majority Russian, however, the Ukrainians there speak Russian, are therefore viewed as Russian by the majority of Ukrainians in the west and the orange part, and are therefore viewed as hostile, of course, to the Western Ukraine's interest. And so Russia's interest goes just beyond the strategic of protecting the warm water port of Sevastopol and Crimea. It also goes to protecting the ethnic Russians and Ukrainians in the east from now the hostile Western Ukrainians, who in 2014 did massacre a lot of them in the east and in Odessa, as there was a lot of riots, especially in Kharkov as well. A lot of pro-Russian protests in the east were crushed brutally. And a lot of their homes were actually burned, I believe. If my memory serves me correct until the last time I served into this matter. So that goes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's also of interest to note that there's some linguistic suppression here as well. The Russian language we've heard reports that the Russian language in the East is starting to be suppressed. There are media outlets that are Russian language that are also being suppressed as well post 2014, which, whether those media outlets are Russian affiliated or Russian supported, I mean, it kind of doesn't matter, right? This is an issue where uh, this is grounds for things to get very complex and for hostilities and grievances to become aggravated here. So that's something to also bear in mind.
Yeah. I also want to add something else. So, like, yeah, to show that this situation is complex, there have also been, reports of neo-Nazi groups that have emerged powerful in Ukraine since 2014, and we've seen through reports that these neo-Nazi groups have basically, attacked ethnic Russians as, they don't want Ukraine to be part of Russia, and so that has also contributed to the tensions that we're seeing within Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, Crusader. In that the quote unquote neo Nazi groups are on the side of the Western Ukrainians and therefore also probably supported by the GAE, which is interesting from the GAE's perspective, considering that they don't like the neo Nazis at home, but they're more than happy to support or fund or whatever other measures for neo Nazis abroad.
Definitely, they see it as an asset to destroy the Russian interest in the eastern Ukraine. It's probably why they support them, of course. But let's move on from this graph here. So let's get into the oppression of Russian opposition in the eastern Ukraine, which the West hasn't been covering, of course. The Ukrainian government started by taking out Russian TV channels off the air, depriving Russia of its propaganda. I hate to use that word, but Russian point of view in the Ukraine. It started by doing that, of course. And then the opposition party, Mr. I forgot what his name is, Medvedchuk? I think that's how you pronounce his name. The Russian, pro-Russian party. His party, he's been arrested and repressed, and this is not a small block. They were the party that finished second in place in the last election, of course. So they're not a minority, an absolute minority. They're a pretty big portion of the eastern Ukraine. And so they've been repressed. And so the Ukrainian government, with GAA backing, supports preventing pro-Russian figures from owning TV station in Ukraine or running for office, of course. And this goes against the narrative of the GAE of free and fair democracy, of course, except when it's your enemy.
Yeah, except when it's a GAE-supported color revolution previously, and now they're just unwilling to let anybody say anything. There's some interesting parallels here to our current situation here in the U.S., which let's not get into, but just for anybody who's reading between the lines, that's a fascinating point.
Yes, and you see why the Ukrainians and Russians in the East view themselves as a separate people, because they have a separate language and culture that goes all the way back to the Kievan Rus and the Treaty of Poltava with the union of Ukraine and Russia. And so they want to be on good relations with Russia, not be suppressed by the pro-Western Ukrainians who seek their destruction culturally, of course, but also violently, as they've been violently attacked recently. And so Russia's security concerns. And so as you can see by this map, with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia took care of that so that Sevastopol will not fall in Western Ukraine's hands. But it wasn't likely to do so anyway, as the majority of the region is ethnically Russian. But you never know these people. The GAE might try anyway. Another one of concerns was that NATO's expansion into Ukraine, which of course Mr. Vladimir Zelensky has been calling for Russia to back off, that Ukraine has a right to self-determination, to determine for itself to become part of NATO, of course, and to allow American ballistic missiles on the eastern borders of Russia. And so this obviously is a very concerning for Russia, as weapons that close to its border would destroy many key assets in the North Caucasus, and possibly, if an alliance with Kazakhstan were to take place, the Volgodon Gap in this area would be threatened, as this is an area critical to Russia. The Volgodon Gap was the Nazis originally tried to cross this gap to take the Caucasus oil fields, of course, and they failed. But if an army were to cut this gap off with the eastern portions of Ukraine, they would cut the Russian Federation off from its main gas and oil supplies in the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea's oil reserves, thus threatening Russia's economic interests as well as its exports to Eastern Europe, which is a major concern for why Russia does not want a Ukraine to join NATO.
All right, this would definitely cripple their economy since their economy is heavily dependent on the oil and gas exports. And if this region's cut off, this could not only affect Russia's economy, but maybe even Europe's economy, since, as we know, Germany and other European states import their oil from Russia. So this could also be negative economically for Europe as well, to some regard, unless the United States takes over and decides to sell oil to Europe in order to cut Russia off. Right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point with the oil. It's a point of interest here to note that Germany has nearly completed, or almost completed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which ultimately comes from Russia. So the sorts of economic concerns here are preeminent, and I'm sure that that's probably something that's geopolitically going to drive Germany's behavior in this, and also other European countries like France as well. Hello?
Anyone here?
Yeah, did we lose a populace?
I think we did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I guess we'll just wait for him to come back.
Yeah. Well, I'll just mention here from that geographical map, right? For anybody who's noticing the from a military perspective, right? Look at how.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm back. Sorry about that.
Okay. I was just about to say, while you were gone, look at Russia's position here in terms of Ukraine. Taking the east of Ukraine would be relatively easy for the Russians, especially east of the Dnieper, because obviously Russia has a northern border with the eastern portion of Ukraine. It has an eastern portion. It also has, the Caucasus region, and of course it's annexed Crimea, right? So it would be very easy to launch an invasion in a pincer movement on Ukraine, which is, if the Russians did so, that's what I would expect.
Yeah, another thing to add on is that if Russia were to take, let's say, eastern Ukraine, that would obviously give them more access to the Black Sea, but it would also be beneficial for them since now they would have more leverage over the Black Sea, and they could also have access to the Mediterranean, and so they could basically use this as a way to counter Turkey economically and militarily, since as of right now, Turkey is the one who predominantly controls the trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But if Russia takes eastern Ukraine, then that could shift the dynamics of this.
Also, the the flat farmland of the eastern Ukraine would provide Russia with a lot of grain exports as well. Lots of farmland, which they already have a lot, especially in the western portions of Russia, not so much in Siberia. But they do in western Russia. There's a lot of farmland and open steppe. But another one of Russia's main concerns, besides the Volgodon Gap, which is why Russia has quashed the potential cover revolution in Kazakhstan recently. They had to take care of that, as Kazakhstan is very close to the Volgodon Gap, and so a friendly government there is paramount to Russia's security interest. But another reason why Russia cannot afford to have this gap closed under any circumstances is the North Caucasus republics, Dagestan, Chechnya, Ingushetia. If they were cut off from Russian forces, they would most likely try to break away again and gain their independence. And most of these groups are not fairly friendly with the Russians, to say the least, as they have a lot of history, especially the Chechens. But the Caucasus people have a long history with the Russians, especially with the repressions and ethnic removal to Central Asia during World War II, as many of them were thought to be collaborators with the Nazis. And so this presents a lot of hostility between the Russians and the North Caucasus people, who view themselves as separate from the Russians mainly. Thus presenting a terrorist threat also to the Russians if these people were to gain their independence, as many of them harbor long-term grudges against the Russian Federation, as we saw in the recent Second Chechen War. A lot of terrorist bombings in central Russia.
Oh yeah, that's true. Because we saw in the Second Chechen War, I mean, Russia did crush Chechnya completely. Like, if you look at the bombings they conducted, they just leveled down Chechnya, but there still is a terrorist threat that still exists there. So it is dangerous on Russia's end because we could see, Chechen terrorists still launch terrorist attacks against Russians since, they hold a grudge for what happened during the Second Chechen War.
Many of these people also hold a grudge for the Russian Empire's annexation of the Caucasus, during which they fought a long, brutal war called the Caucasian War for almost 50 years, I believe. It was a very long war in which they bitterly fought the Russians, Imperial Russians, for their independence. Of course, they lost that war. And so many of them view that as a turning point in their history of being subjugated to the Russians, and also spreading a lot of hostility as for why many of these people were pro-Nazi inclined to be, a lot of these people in the Caucasus as well. So that's one of Russia's main concerns also, with a friendly Ukraine. So controlling the eastern Ukraine would close this gap, increasing its security, also increasing Russia's security. Concerns with terrorism from the North Caucasus republics as well. And so let's go on to where we are right now, and the Western posturing for war, of course, as we are seeing. Sorry about that. So, as we saw right now, the West is constantly posturing us that Russia's going to invade any day now. Zelensky recently said, like, they're going to invade on Wednesday, of course. And now they're saying he's being sarcastic, of course. And so the narrative keeps changing every day with that.
Right. Supposedly, I was seeing some Twitter chatter yesterday afternoon, evening, about how that estimation of when the Russian invasion was going to be on the 16th, that seems to have been determined that it came from the intelligence community, the American intelligence community. So that makes me automatically skeptical that that's imminent. But it is interesting to have seen the change in rhetoric from President Zelensky, who has basically done a complete 180 about face on this. Whereas before he was very, a week ago, he was relatively dismissive that there was going to be a Russian invasion. And, now he's changed his tune a little bit to just basically begin saying that, oh, we're going to defend Ukraine, blah, 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 all the usual, rhetorical things of what you'd expect from somebody who's about to be invaded.
Yeah, especially since 2/3 of Russia's brigade units, or what they're called, PISs or whatever, have been moved to the western Ukrainian border. And this has been seen by the West as posturing for an invasion, of course, an annexation of eastern Ukraine. But of course, the West has also been posturing for a war and being very aggressive to Russia, especially since 2014. Well, with Zelensky's rhetoric recently and his suppression of the Ukrainian and Russian minority in the east of the country, of course, which is why Russia has moved many of their units to the eastern Ukraine to counteract this potential aggression against the Donetsk and Luhansk republics in the east, as you can see on this map here. So Russia sees this as a long-term investment, of course. I don't see an invasion by the U.S. as likely to intervene in this war if a war were to break out, of course. The NATO troops, as you can see on this map, are very tiny. I believe the U.S. did send another brigade to Poland, if I'm correct, recently.
Yes, I think I saw some chatter about the United States sending the airborne units over there to Poland and deploying them.
Yeah.
But again, there is a massive military disparity, of course, with Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine would just Russia would crush Ukraine if a war were to break out. There's no point of posturing this idea that Ukraine is a modern army that can take on and win.
No.
It cannot. It's mostly post-Soviet equipment, mostly, and a few modern anti-aircraft guns from the U.S. recently, especially from Nato recently.
Yeah, I wonder if Belarus will also get involved. Like, I know Belarus obviously supports Russia, but I wonder if they might send in some of their troops as well from the north.
Lukashenko recently said that he would support Russia in a war against Ukraine.
That's interesting. From an order of battle perspective, I don't know what Belarus's army is like, but I'm pretty sure. Last week I did a stream with the Prudentialist, and we basically had mentioned that Belarus has a couple of like Russian airborne military units in Belarus stationed there. So that's an interesting point, that Russia has the ability to utilize Belarus for possible launching of military forces.
Yeah, and the potential of a war, obviously, for eastern Ukraine. If a war were to break out, my prediction is that Russia would try to annex the pro-Russian area from Odessa to Luhansk and to Transnistria, as this area is mostly pro-Russian anyway. They wouldn't try to conquer all of Ukraine, as Western Ukraine is very pro-U.S. and Western forces. So this idea that the Ukrainians would resist validly and they would create such a resistance that Russia would have to pull back is just not true. Many people on the east of the eastern Ukraine would welcome them, actually. That doesn't mean all of them, of course. A lot of them would flee to the western Ukraine, but a lot of them would welcome Russian troops into eastern Ukraine, as they would see it as a long-term security interest.
Yeah, and as of last week, there was a report about a Russian naval group, which is an amphibious naval group that was being in the Eastern Mediterranean and was apparently moving towards the Black Sea, which I think now isn't actually in the Black Sea. And we don't exactly know what was in those 6 ships. There's been no reports that I've seen that have mentioned that. But in my estimation, that's probably likely that if the Russians were preparing for some sort of invasion, that expeditionary group would likely have some sort of extra land forces, tanks, etc. In those vessels, and basically they would be utilized to support an attack on Odessa.
Yeah, if Russia were to invade, I agree with American populists. I think they're just going to only take eastern Ukraine, basically go after the regions that are predominantly Russian, and in the end, they'll probably just turn Ukraine into like a landlocked country. I mean, we could also see a refugee crisis unfold as well, but that's basically what I think is going to happen if they decide to invade.
Right, and from an invasion perspective, that's the best possible card that Russia could play, right? Which you're not actually fully invading Ukraine; you're just taking those areas which you have, I guess, an ethnic and cultural claim to, which from the perspective of narrative is very important, right? Because by the time you actually get to the western portions of Ukraine, once NATO actually starts to rev up, it's likely that American and NATO forces would be able to enter into the eastern Ukraine. The United States would be able to bring in more troops, et cetera, et cetera. There would be a greater response by the time you get to the western Ukraine. So from Russia's perspective, the cost benefit there is probably a little high.
Most likely it is, but they also see Russia sees Ukraine a potential annexation of the Novorossiya area, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. They see it as a long-term investment because in a long enough timeline, Ukraine will become a NATO member and will become hostile even further to the Russians. And they are close to that Volgodon Gap, as I mentioned earlier, thus threatening many of Russia's internal security and its lifeline as a state, gas and oil from the Caucasus and Caspian Sea. And so a threat to this area just isn't acceptable to the Russians. And so they see this as a long-term investment. And so any possible resistance from occupation of eastern Ukraine would not last very long, in my opinion. Maybe for a couple weeks or month, and they would die out, as many of those pro-Western Ukrainians would just go to Western Ukraine. Most likely is what would happen, actually.
Yeah, because taking eastern Ukraine would be geopolitically beneficial for Russia because, if Ukraine were to join NATO, NATO wouldn't be as close to like the Caucasus area with Russia, so this could ensure that Russia can protect, the oil fields that it has within the Caucasus regions, and eastern Ukraine would also benefit Russia agriculturally since they'll have access to all the fertile land that Ukraine can provide to them.
They would also see the protection of the pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine as essential as well, as protecting them is seen as Russia's.
Yeah.
And so that's the current situation that we're in right now, of course, with the situation in the Western media changing every second. From we're not going to war to we're going to war. It changes every second, of course. It's very sporadic.
Right, and even today, there's a little bit of a drawdown. So apparently this morning or yesterday evening there was some talk about how Russia was just simply conducting some exercises, basically with some infantry units, and now those infantry units are now being retracted from the border regions of Ukraine, and it's too early to tell what's going to happen here. So for me, what I see under the hood is that Russia was probably positioning all of these troops in an effort to establish a sort of credible threat, and really what they want is they want a sort of diplomatic solution here. They want the reassurance in a sort of like political declaration, etc., that NATO is not going to subsume Ukraine into part of NATO, and so this is kind of what Russia's doing here, is they're kind of using their military might as a way to extract diplomatic concessions here without actually going to war. But from the perspective of the GAE, right, the GAE sees Russia as, I guess, quote unquote, the most based nation, right? This is a tendency that the GA pretty much always has. It doesn't matter what the official ideology of any country is. The GA will always go after whoever it perceives as the most based. And that's kind of how, the foreign policy establishment in Washington thinks about Russia, right? So on an ideological level, I mean, Russia wants these regions because it sees these areas as its own. It has a legitimate claim to them on an ethnic and cultural and spiritual level, whereas the GA sees Russia as like the big evil, non-liberal democracy boogeyman, right? Because obviously there's elections in Russia and that sort of thing, but the West does not perceive Russia as actually being democratic. So that's why you see the West so ideologically opposed to Russia.
Yeah, they also see, as we saw with the Ukraine suppression of pro-Russian Ukrainians in the East. If they try to voice their concerns, they're very liberal, so they don't get a voice, of course. This only applies one way. It's only free and fair election when GA interests win. If pro-Russian interests were to win, the election is obviously rigged, as we all know.
Yeah.
Right. it's being able to suppress oligarchy is what Putin's strategy is. I mean, the Western democracy likes to classify Putin's style of governance as very oligarchic, but I don't see that at all. I think that he's actually much better at keeping his own oligarchs in line, and somebody like Dugin writes extensively about this, in that he talks about how the elite classes in Russia is very similar to the Western elite class. They have Western interests. They like the idea of the Western Enlightenment, and that is at odds with the population. But what Putin essentially has, done politically is to make sure that he's like taking a moderate, almost a moderate position between the pro-Western segments of modernity and the more Russophilic vision of Dugin, the more Eurasianist vision of Dugin, and um, so his style of governance to me seems to be much more able to deal effectively with those competing interests.
Yeah, I would
And
definitely agree with that.
and I also like because if you look at Russia's state after the collapse of the USSR with Boris Yeltsin, like the West actually had good relations with Russia because they viewed Yeltsin as like a weak leader who's easy to manipulate, and it's not like he had control over the oligarchs. It was pretty much the opposite. But now when Putin came to charge, they see Putin as a threat because Putin's basically just trying to like push back against the Western leverage of Eastern Europe, and he's trying to, I guess you could say, allow for Russia to rise in prominence. And so I guess that's why the West has now developed this anti-Russian foreign policy, since they know that Putin is like, I guess, like a strong leader who they cannot just manipulate, as opposed to what they do with Yeltsin.
Right, right. They definitely don't like the strong style of leadership, and they definitely don't like the idea that a leader of a country might actually indulge the interests of his population, might actually do things that are for the benefit of his population and not just the people who have elite interests.
Definitely, definitely. The big gay also sees Russia's resistance to becoming a fully integrated member of the GAA as a threat to its own power base, of course, because the GAA isn't used to having any power block be separate from their control, which is why they have a very hostile view of China as well, which is positive in some ways, but they have the same view for Russia, of course, as they are not GAE under influenced. So that's why they view them as a threat mainly.
And
Yeah, it's also important to note, in terms of a relative strength, right? The GAE considers China a much greater threat, and ideologically, the CCP is still officially in power. That's the official ideology, even though they're much more of a market based system than a true communist would prefer. So China is on a population level, on a technological and industrial level, a much greater threat to the GAE than Russia is. So for them, Russia kind of seems like easy pickings. I think the GAE, if it preferred its way, would just kind of let China have its zone of control in the Pacific, and would much prefer to squash Russia for the ideological reasons.
yeah, also to add on to that, also we see how Western elites also have business ties with China. So because of this, they're like more reluctant to do anything about China as opposed to Russia, since Russia isn't economically beneficial to them as opposed to China, which is why we see them develop this aggressive foreign policy towards Russia, and because they want to like paint a picture that Russia is the greatest geopolitical threat that the West is facing.
Yeah, they want to deflect from the internal threat, which is them, of course, the GAE, the gay empire, from anyone who would be a threat or outside the system, is viewed as an external threat to be used by the propaganda machine, which is why they're posturing so much currently, especially with this Ukraine situation. Another thing I wanted to add also to Russia's interest, controlling the eastern Ukraine pro-Russian area. Much of that area is flat. It's part of the vast European plain, which is very flat, which made it easy for the Nazis in World War II and the Germans in World War I to conquer vast areas fairly easily, as there isn't very many natural borders stopping an army from advancing in the east. It also makes supply lines more difficult and gives an army defending much more time to repair defenses if you have more land that you can retreat from, in a sense.
Um, yeah, I think another reason as to why we see, the West being so invested in this situation is also because I think they have also ties with Ukrainian oligarchs, and we know in the United States, certain politicians have had ties in Ukraine, which is why I think they're becoming so like invested in this conflict.
Yeah, it's also an ideological one, I think, that motivates them, as they want to expand the big gay to Ukraine. It's a very spiritual component to these people, actually, as expanding the gay is seen as critical to becoming a great patriotic zealot. And so that's why they view a non-liberal Ukraine as a potential hostile threat in the future, or a base for Russian.
Right, and that sort of woke evangelization is you know a primary driver of these people. I think we can all agree on that.
Definitely, they're very ideological in
Yeah,
their
there are a lot of
motives.
factors that are going into this. There's ideological factors, there's economic factors, and geopolitical factors.
But what's your rating on this? Do you think an actual invasion is likely, or no?
No,
Um, I mean, it is possible, but I don't think it's gonna happen as like the West is saying it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Noble. I don't think it's going to be a total annexation. I think it's more going to be, if it were to happen, it's going to be Nouveau Russia map, most likely, as that would be very easy to control. Less partisans, access to the Black Sea, strategic interests are protected as well, as I mentioned earlier.
yep.
Um,
And as I mentioned earlier too, it'll be relatively quick to take and hold those regions. There's going to be less of a GA response. Less Ukrainian ability to defensible border like on the Dnieper, um, and
um, we might see the West impose severe sanctions on Russia, like because they've been saying that if Russia does an invasion, they're gonna, I believe, kick them out of the SWIFT bank or something.
Yeah, they
yeah,
have
that would
threatened that before.
yeah they've threatened that before, but that would impose some costs on the GAE as well,
Yeah,
like
But I
all
believe the
economic
Russian
sanctions.
ambassador to Sweden said he doesn't give a shit about sanctions, which is kind of funny.
yeah. I think even if they put sanctions on Russia, I think Russia's like already developed a plan to pass by those sanctions. So,
Right, Russia's dealt with this situation before from 2014, so there's a level of accumulated institutional knowledge of how to deal with this stuff. So Russia, I would agree, would definitely have a plan for this in place of how to deal with these sorts of things to um, mitigate any sort of GAU response on the Russian homeland.
Definitely, they would probably coordinate with China as well. They probably have a plan for as well. I believe they plan to have their own banking system
oh yeah,
as a competition to SWIFT, I believe, from the last time I heard about it.
Russia is
Um,
also a member of the BRICS, so they might use the BRICS as like a way to go by these sanctions.
right, and Russia also is financially is in a very strong position, certainly much stronger than the GAE is. Um, it's been noted that Russia's debt to GDP ratio is only 18%, which is incredible for modern democratic governments. Um, and Russia also famously has quite a large reserve of gold and precious metals, especially gold. Even though last year with the oil crisis they kind of had to sell off some, they still have quite a bit of gold lying around in their reserves, so they are able, to have some sort of, hard asset to be able to sell off if they ever really got into economic trouble.
They also have a large reserve of euros, as a backup to that as well. They've largely moved away from the US dollar to avoid any problems with that from the US sanctions. So they've moved towards the euro reserves that they have as a counter to that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they're trying to distance themselves from like being dependent on the EU's currency. But
It could be as well. All right, well, I'm going to bring up some questions and then we can end the stream. Cooper Star Nationalist asked, the question is, do they reach Berlin or Paris?
Neither.
no, unless it's. I guess the only way they could have done that was during World War II if America didn't intervene in Europe, but I don't see them doing it today.
No, this is not likely at all for many reasons. It wouldn't be in Russia's interest to do that, to engage in a very expensive war like that.
Yeah. A very quick smash and grab, take and hold action is probably what's most likely in the East, and then they'll probably stop on the Dnieper and also in the areas of Novorossiya, as we've mentioned before. So that's the most likely scenario from Russia's perspective of how to achieve the maximum gain at the minimal amount of cost.
Yeah, one thing you can say about Putin is he's very strategic and he's very pragmatic. He's not this eccentric who wants to go for these goals that are impossible to achieve. He's very pragmatic in his views about war. If you understand the 2008 Georgian War as well, and his intervention with his protege, he's very pragmatic. Putin is very pragmatic in his views.
Yeah, he knows what he's doing.
Exactly, which is why he has an advantage over the GAE. And so to conclude this live stream, Russia's interests are real. They're not irrational, as many people in the Western media are screeching about. They do have an interest in protecting the historical, spiritual people of Eastern Ukraine, and many of them view themselves as Russian, even though they won't say it due to persecution by the Western Ukrainians and the Nazis who are persecuting them as well. But also strategic reasons, as we mentioned before, the Volgodon Gap, the Caucasus oil fields, the Caspian Sea. That would also prevent many terrorist problems, of course, from Central Asia and the Caucasus people. So that's why it's a very strategic interest that Russia has here. And they're not insane, they're pretty rational. And like many people in the Western media will screech at you. We have another comment from Harry Tentacle. And Russia's most hawkish analysts say that long-term goal is to complete removal of Ukrainian identity. However, Russia won't do anything right now when the word policeman is around.
Absolutely, which is why I'm very skeptical as to that the intelligence predictions that there's going to be an invasion on the 16th, which is tomorrow. We'll see. We'll find out tomorrow. But I think one of the best things that Putin can do against the GAE is basically to make them look extremely foolish. And that's kind of what he could do is, basically make it look like he's going to invade and then not invade when the GAE says he is, which makes them, embarrassed again. So that's one thing that he can do. And then, of course, he can, continue to support, Ukrainian separatists and, pro-Russian elements within Ukraine and continue building support there in the meantime. So when the time is right and the GA is actually weak and not, sniffing around, that's when I would expect him to actually send in the tanks.
Yeah, he's obviously not going to do it now. That's now you have the GAE on alert, and so Putin's just going to basically troll them, by not invading, and when they're distracted, he'll invade and take it quickly.
Right, and right now the GAE actually would love a conflict, considering it's flagging at home. The regime at home is weak and is lacking a lot of support and is doubtful. So entering into a war over Ukraine is one way to continuously squash dissent, and also B, to get another distraction, right? A flagging regime at home will always typically get itself involved in foreign conflicts and foreign affairs as a way of distracting the public from domestic problems. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason domestically, if Putin is really smart, he would understand that that's kind of what the U.S. is looking for right now. Is the U.S. wants to go to war with Russia. They want to get involved. That's basically what I think Putin is going to do. I don't think he'll send in the tanks quite yet.
Yeah. And as we can see, we see like the American empire is gradually falling. Like for instance, with Afghanistan, like Putin saw the disaster at Afghanistan. Like he knows the American empire is weakening, but to him, it's not a matter of like he just needs to basically understand as to when the right time to attack is, because he knows it's obviously not going to be tomorrow, since that's when the West is preparing for war. So he has to do it in like a time where it will be immensely beneficial for Russia. And
Also, by not invading, he further discredits Western intelligence, which has been fairly discredited, actually, for many lies about conflict and supposed invasion dates and threats of WMDs in Iran and Iraq and such.
But what is pretty fishy is that Zelensky a week ago was saying that everything's all right. There's not going to be war. Now a week later, he's like saying war is imminent. War is imminent. So it is pretty interesting to see how he just flip flopped in just a week.
Yeah, I would suggest that that's probably due to American intelligence reporting and also likely a pressure as well, rather than any sort of like genuine desire for conflict on the part of the Romanian or Ukrainians.
Yeah, because you'll often hear people in the media saying how Russia's trying to use Ukraine, but at the same time, you also have the West trying to use Ukraine for its own benefits. So
And also, the West is doing the majority of the damage to the Ukrainian economy by causing this war scare, or just destroying the Ukrainian economy, doing Russia actually a favor for when the time is right, ironically enough.
oh yeah, and when Russia takes half of Ukraine, this will be detrimental to the West, since they're just gonna, they already lost Afghanistan. Now they're gonna lose Eastern Ukraine. This will, you know, be bad for the American regime. But yeah.
I do agree with that, and I think we had a great discussion about Ukraine and the situation from Russia's point of view. Pretty sane and rational reasons, and we get the historical analysis of why Russia views Novorossiya as an essential part of its territory. And you get the oppression of Russian minorities in Ukraine, of course, as a free and fair democracy, which is just a lie. You get the truth about that. And so, with that saying, do you guys have anything you'd like to show before we get out of here today?
Yeah, I'd like to show my channel. I recently made a reply guide video to Settler's Lament on the question of whether or not Russia is based, and I just gave out my case of why Russia should be considered the preeminent example of the most basedest nation right now in the current environment. So if you'd like, you can go check out my YouTube channel. I'm on Gab. You can follow me on Twitter. I also tend to hang out in the Prudentialist Telegram chat a lot, so you can find me in those places if you would like to interact with me more.
Yeah. And for me, my channel's it's in the link in the description. I recently made a Ukrainian video. It's pretty short, but if you're interested, just go and watch it. You can also follow me on Twitter, and yeah.
All right, folks, and if you enjoyed that stream, please like and sub, as I have a lot of more epic content on the way, many epic more streams like this in the future. And so have a great day, everyone.